Thank you, Bonnie, for your beautiful words. It is an honor and a pleasure to be with you, and I want to thank Bonnie Culver once again for making this possible. It is also a pleasure to be among colleagues who, like myself, have embarked on a journey that seemed new and exciting, but along the way sometimes became a long, winding, uphill trek that required a large dose of perseverance and faith. I want you to know that I've been a non-official student of the MFA program. We shared mentors, editors, and agents. And I have learned, as you have, that writing a book is a collaborative effort. Leonardo Padura, a Cuban writer who still lives in Cuba, one of the few who still live in Cuba, says in his new book, Water on Every Side, writing is never easy, and to decide to be a writer is almost madness. So why write? Not a journal, and not something for one's eyes only, but a memoir, and one that is intended to be published. Well, I can only speak for myself, and this is where I'll begin. As some of you know, and now all of you know, I trained as a psychoanalyst, a rigorous training that lasted 5 years and involved a personal analysis of 10 years, 4 times a week. Yes, you heard correctly, 4 times a week. I never had a conscious desire to write fiction or literary nonfiction, among other things because of my profession. I was trained to listen and to think about what my patients were saying beyond the conscious meaning of his or her words. And to do this, I had to put myself in parenthesis and try to reveal as little as possible about my own personal life. Added to this, being Norman Mailer's daughter put a damper on any budding desire to write. It was a minefield, one that I preferred not to enter. I wrote papers that were published in psychoanalytic journals, and my aim was someday to write a book related to my field. So how did I end up writing a memoir? Most of us like to talk about ourselves, tell our story. And to us, our story usually seems interesting. I enjoyed listening to my patients, but part of me also wanted to speak up and was crouching, waiting for a chance to make an appearance. This opportunity came after my father's death, which liberated me in a way I could not define at the moment. A few years later, I was invited to be the keynote speaker at the Norman Mailer Society conference. And as I began writing the piece, which I decided would be about going to the bullfights with him in Mexico when I was 5 years old, clear memories appeared from a deep well I had forgotten existed. What is more, I enjoyed writing it so much that I thought, hey, I want to do more of this, and decided to begin writing vignettes of my life with Dad, figuring it wouldn't be that hard to eventually turn it into a memoir. As you might imagine, I was totally mistaken. The first thing I learned was that a memoir was not a series of vignettes, no matter how interesting or funny or well put together. A memoir had structure, and it had to have a narrative arc. But I'm not going to talk about that today. What I want to develop today is something else. It is a phrase I was to hear many times, a phrase I'm sure many of you have heard before, and it has become a mantra. You have to go deeper. When I wrote the chapter about my first years in Chile, the first version only had 1 paragraph about my psychoanalytic about my psychoanalytic experience. Kaylee Jones, my mentor, sent me an email. She said, "What? 1 paragraph for your analysis? Why were you angry? What upset you? What was excruciating to think about again? What happened in those 10 years? You have to go deeper, and we need more description. What did her office look like? What did she look like? We don't know these people. You must introduce them to us." I resisted. Hey, Kaylee, no one wants to know about my psychoanalysis. I think it's enough to say I worked through my anger and resentment towards my parents. No, she said. No, she said, it's not enough. She was adamant. So I tried to go deeper, as deep as I could at that moment. And that paragraph became a chapter. It was not an easy task for me, who was used to keeping myself protected behind the couch. At that moment, I realized I was in the center of a paradox. I wanted to write about myself. Finally, I had the stage to do it. No dad, just me. But at the same time, I didn't want to expose myself because of my patients. Memoirs involve personal exposure. And readers of your book will know about your life, and depending on how many secrets you want to open, they will find out what you had under lock and key, or to only open to a select few. You have to decide what you want to include and what you'd like to keep tucked away in that private room. On this theme, there was one particular chapter I especially wrestled with. It's called Underground Wars. It tells, among other events, about my teenage pregnancy. I knew it was important to include it because it clearly showed how my father supported me all this time, and how his being there for me illuminated a quality about his parenting that many people couldn't imagine. He was not only the celebrity who could be violent, get drunk, and be a notorious womanizer. He could also be a supportive, understanding father that made me feel protected. It was an important event that surpassed my need for privacy. It created a link in our bond and had to be brought to light. I knew it, but every time I read it, I'd think of my patients and how they'd react. Looking back, I still ask myself the question, why was the teenage pregnancy harder to reveal than many other events in my life? Perhaps because it opened up the window to a sexual analyst. And therapists, like parents, are many times considered asexual by their patients. To be clear, this was not the most difficult passage to write. It actually flowed, but I had to struggle to include it in the book. I even asked Haley, hey Kaylee, don't you think I could just cut out this pregnancy stuff? No, are you crazy? You can't take that out. That has to be included, she said. So I knew it had to be there. But I had to struggle. And I'm sure every memoirist will have his or her share of similar tough decisions. In the end, for me, it boiled down to choosing the quality of the book over my profession. I'm not even sure if my patients, who are in Chile and speak Spanish, most of them, if and when they read the memoir, which is in English, will feel the same way. This was my problem. On the other hand, some chapters were relatively easy to write. The section on Mexico was a joyful remembrance of the happy years I spent there. Of course, there were many painful experiences of separation that I relived and even cried over as I wrote them. But they were the kind of pain that is bittersweet, nostalgic, or even good to feel again. Not the unbearable or excruciating kind. They were emotions that were relatively easy to conjure and hold in my mind, and then type into the Microsoft Word in my computer. The same was not true of other chapters. One especially painful, or I should say excruciating one, is called Silent Spaces. It's the chapter that plunges into the darkest episode of our family, my father's stabbing of his second wife, Adele, mother to my sisters Danielle and Elizabeth. I went to places I had never been to while I was writing it. I realized the effect that act had on me. I was 10 years old when that happened. I was 11, actually. Danielle was 3 and Betsy was 1. I realized the effect that act had on me, the hidden shame I always felt, and also the fear of this other father, not the one of my early childhood who took me skiing, but the one who drank and was aggressive and volatile. With a shock, while I was writing this, I realized that my attitude toward him in those early years of my adolescence was that of the child of an alcoholic parent. And I had not really captured this during my 10 years, 4 times a week analysis. So I could say that writing this memoir for me was a second analysis, and I would venture to say it is probably true to most who stick to this journey to the end. Another painful chapter to write was about my move to Chile. I really had to go deeper and try to understand why I made that decision and why I stayed in that country during dictatorship for 10 years. In doing so, I learned how being anonymous in that country, which in the end became my home, helped me bond profoundly with my siblings, with being a mailer and my American persona. I found out I liked being Norman Mailer's daughter and that I felt proud of it. A few years ago, I had my astrological chart read. Astro John, the astrologer, told me I was like Persephone, Demeter's daughter. Do you all remember the myth of Persephone and Demeter? Okay. He said, Astro John, I had to move to the end of the world to get away from my mother. But I immediately saw that the myth was a metaphor for my life before I went to Chile. I grew up divided between Mom in sunny Mexico and Dad in the gray winter months of New York. If you remember, Demeter is sequestered. She's captured by Hades and taken into the underworld. And finally, Demeter and Hades come to an agreement, and Persephone will spend half of the year with Demeter and half of the year in the underworld in Hades. And that's how winter and summer began, according to the Greek myth. So I grew up divided between Mom in sunny Mexico and Dad in the gray winter months of New York. Later, when I willingly moved to the end of the world, because Chile is at the end of the world, literally, the stage was set for me to find out where I was from and how I belonged to my family. And it was only in writing In Another Place that I understood all of this. A little bit more on depth. We were joking about how I couldn't drop the pages or confuse them, but they're in order. Don't worry. More on depth. I sent the manuscript once it was finished to Chris Tomasino. Over lunch, she said to me, "I don't get a clear view of you. I feel as if I'm looking at your life through a veil. Readers want to get to know you, and you can't take anything for granted. You must dig deeper." I thought, oh God, here we go again. Then I showed it to Mike Lennon, and he edited it. His observations were the same. "Susan, you gotta go deeper," he said. "There isn't enough, you gotta fluff it up." There seemed only one way out, or should I say, in. I took the plunge, shook off the veil, and exposed myself. And after another 2 years of rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, I was finished. I had done my job. It was ready to be published. That's when Northampton House Press took it. So I sent my manuscript again, this time to Lenore Hart, my editor, thinking, this is going to be easy. After all, I'm done. Guess what? She said, "You have to go deeper." She also said, "You must pay attention to continuity and transitions." She, of course, meant in the writing, but it was not lost on me that one important theme in my life and in the book was discontinuity and no transitions. Fascinating how I had built into the structure of my book the theme of my life. The contents of the memoir mirrored the blocks of my life, and I wanted to keep it that way. I resisted adding continuity where there had been none in my childhood, and building stepping stones to transition from one chapter to another when my sensation was I had not been given time to do the transition from one country to another. I liked that the book was lacking in transitions. I wanted it to be a mirror of my own life. I had many discussions with myself and with Lenore, all over email, until I finally let go of what I thought was my special signature. I took her advice, and I don't regret it. I guess the moral of the story is you don't have to pay attention to everything your editor says, but keep in mind that at least they're right at least half of the time. So it took me 4 years to write this book. 4 years and a half, I would say. 1 year for the first draft, and 3 years plus for the numerous other drafts. Several readers, aside from those I mentioned, Ross Clavin and Laurie Weinstein among them, offered insightful comments, most of them variations on the theme of depth. I knew very little of the nuts and bolts that go into writing a memoir. I had no formal knowledge about the structure of a book. My knowledge came from reading, and once I decided to write a memoir, I probably read every memoir a child of a famous father has published. I'm exaggerating, not every memoir, but every memoir I could get my hands on. I was fascinated with the similarities and differences. Reading other daughters' experiences helped me tweak out what was special, interesting, and unique about my own. And I must say that among the memoirs that I read Alexandra Styron's, I read Kaylee Jones' memoir about her mother. I read about Erica Heller's memoir, and Sexton's daughter, and so on. And it really was fascinating to see how the similarities, the fame, having a parent who's there but not really there, having to always take care of the writing. The writing is the most important thing, especially with Alexandra Styron's memoir, I felt that. One last word on the act of writing. All my life, I saw my father write. Every day of his life, and I'm only exaggerating slightly, he sat down in front of his yellow pads with a pencil, and he wrote. Or he went through the galleys to correct. He used to be fond of saying, if you're going to write, you have to write. And you should write every day. He also said in The Spooky Art, and I'm paraphrasing him, if you decide to write on a given day, your unconscious is geared to the work. If you don't write, your unconscious will feel cheated, and you will pay a price. All the work that has gone into the preparation will have been in vain. You might have lost precious material and will probably have to wait a long time to get the urge again. So if you decide to write, do it. My experience is different from Norman's. As most of you, I had other work aside from writing, work that took up a lot of mental energy. I'd get home after being close to 8 hours in my office and didn't always feel like sitting down to write. At first, I felt guilty for not doing my daily homework, not digging into the page, letting my unconscious flow. But after a while, I realized I was always thinking about the memoir. Even when I wasn't writing, I was working. And when I finally sat down to write, it was the product of many days of mulling, digesting, reflecting on a specific passage or chapter. There were other moments when I could hardly wait to get home to write. I believe I could do it because I had done my homework previously. I had let my unconscious unravel the mysteries before I sat down in front of the computer. The blank page was first and foremost a mental blank page that I worked on over the course of a few hours, days, or weeks before I could transcribe it into words, paragraphs, and pages. As I wrap up, I ask myself again, why write? Wilfred Bion, one of my favorite psychoanalytic thinkers, coined the phrase, thoughts without a thinker. to express an interesting idea. He meant, in order for thoughts to come to life, there needs to be someone to think them. It's not a new idea. Luigi Pirandello wrote 6 characters in search of an author, and Miguel de Unamuno had his characters speaking to him in his wonderful novel, Niebla. When I write, I enter a dimension where thoughts are suspended in that internal space we call the mind, which is also in the heart, in the muscles, or in the belly. In deep concentration, phrases spring from forming paragraphs that capture my history and elusive emotions. Characters long dead revive. I smile at them, see the twinkle in their eyes, and can recapture them. Even if only briefly. When we write, or at least when I write, I go into that mysterious internal place and lose myself in it. It's an exquisitely intimate experience, perhaps the only one in which I am totally alone, oblivious to the passage of time, and in the company of those unformed, elusive thoughts, struggling with the words that can accurately bring them to life, mold them into sentences and paragraphs that convey what was there without totally being aware of it. Which is why many times when I reread what I've written, I think, who wrote this? Or how did I think of this? Or where did this come from? For me, this is what makes writing a pleasure and a torture. It's what gives me pause, makes me procrastinate, walk in circles, following my tail, like a dog looking for a place to sit down, until I sit down and write. Thank you.